Oh, sorry.
Good evening. Welcome everyone to New Haven Public Library, coming to you live from this beautiful building. Tonight's program, Italian Americans, a Progressive Tradition, in our Summer at 7 American Experience series. Put aside Anderson Cooper. Put aside your Johnny Carson reruns. I like both also, but I'm Tom Costa, Adult Services Librarian and your co-host tonight, joined by my two co-hosts, the legendary programmer Seth Godfrey and the tech-savvy Shannon Carter. What brief thoughts do our co-hosts have to share tonight? Seth.
Thanks, Tom. I'm Seth Godfrey. I'm head of Adult Services, and it's such a pleasure to put together this Summer at 7, our virtual author talk, and the American Experience. And I just want to say, it was 18 years ago. It was fabulous to have Jerry, who came in from Brooklyn, to give a talk. It was the 100th anniversary of Veto Marcantonio. The room was packed. And I have never seen, our former director, may he rest in peace, Jim Wellborn, said, "You've got to bring Jerry back." And here it is 18 years later. It's one of our best Sunday programming. And it was so timely, such an inclusive program, discussion of Veto Marcantonio's life. And it's something we need more than ever, unity amongst people. And certainly issues in New Haven around the Columbus statue and other issues in the community. And I think we're so fortunate to have Jerry with us tonight. I wish he was in person, but hopefully one day. And Jerry, thanks so much for being here, taking the time with us.
Thank you, Seth.
Shannon, do you have any thoughts?
Just that I'm here for the technical side of things. So if anyone has any questions, use the Q&A, and if you have any comments, use the chat, and I'll be in there.
Okay, to start on a note of humor, as you might imagine, we are the 7 p.m. warm-up act for the Republican National Convention later tonight. We're billed as the Convention of Enlightenment. We're an important lead-in. We'll be presenting for 1.5 hours tonight. AOC was only given 1 minute. So first, I'd like to thank our co-sponsor, the Veto Marcantonio Forum. Thank you. Our presenter tonight is Gerald Meyer, Professor Emeritus of Ostos Community College, City University of New York, CUNY. To refresh memories again, Professor Meyer did appear live here at NHFPL in 2002. We had coffee and a great New Haven audience that was equally alive. We always wanted him to return for an encore program. It only took us 18 years to work out the details and make it timely. So tonight's format, an uninterrupted author talk of 45 to 55 minutes. This is in webinar format. So we ask you to please submit your questions at any time in the Q&A section on the lower part of your screen during the talk. We'll follow up the talk with a half hour or so of your questions taken from this Q&A section. So let's get started. Professor Meyer was founding member of the faculty of Ostos Community College, CUNY. He authored this book, Veto Marcantonio, Radical Politician. Co-edited The Lost World of Italian American Radicalism, and has had published over 90 articles and reviews on a wide range of subjects. Meyer serves on the editorial boards of Socialism and Democracy and Science and Society, appears in documentaries, reviews manuscripts for publication, and lectures widely. He is co-chair of the Veto Marcantonio Forum. Gerald Meyer is currently putting on the finishing touches of his latest book, The Unity of the People, Studies of Italian American Radicalism, included in tonight's program. And you're getting a free first preview of this book. Not even the New York Times has this yet. So sit back, take another sip of your homemade sangria or your flavored coffee. You know, Shannon and I, we can smell the aroma from here. And let's now welcome Gerald Meyer, back again, live on Zoom.
Thank you for the very warm introduction. I appreciate that very much. I remember the event, you know, oh my God, it was 2002, 100th anniversary of Vito Marcantonio's birth. And my partner, Luis Romero, and I, we came to New Haven. And, you know, we know-it-alls from Brooklyn. Well, we got lost. I'm telling you, we absolutely got lost. And we were wandering around a lot. And we went into Albany. Anyway, people were kind, and we got there a little late, but it wasn't a disaster, you know. And I liked the whole event. It was the audience was so knowledgeable and so with it, you know. And I spoke with a wonderful woman. She was a little bit older than me. I don't remember her name. And she very gently told me what the right pronunciation is of La Follette. But I'm not sure what it is now. So if anyone knows the right, you know, pronunciation of La Follette, please get in touch with me. But, you know, it's everything that not everything, but so much of what I've done is come out of a kind of I don't know, unexpected, unplanned development that when I first started out, you know, I was writing my dissertation and so on, I wanted to write something useful for the left. For my master's thesis, I wrote about Khrushchev's Virgin Lands program in Kazakhstan, which was a big disaster. So I said, why did I do that? I have to do something that's positive for the left. So the Vito Marcantonio, his name would just come, you know, through here and there in this kind of mysterious way. And I don't know, I remember one thing they said, well, when they had street corner rallies, he wouldn't allow them to have folk music. He said, people in East Harlem don't listen to folk music, you know? And so I said, well, let me take a look at this. And I went to the library and where his papers are, New York Public Library. And it was very late. It was raining and it was very late. And it was like maybe 4 o'clock. They were going to close at 5. So I said, well, is it possible? They said, no, you could look at something. So I somehow just said, well, what about 1950? And it said letters. I said, what are the letters from 1950? So the librarian took that out, and this huge box plumped on the table. Oh, dear God, what is this going to happen? There's 60 of these boxes. Well, I actually went through all of them eventually. And I started to pick out letters. They were very moving. The penmanship was so good. And there was a very familiar tone to it. And because it was part of his organization, they stapled the envelope. So there was the address. So we had the surname, the address, the date. You could really see these people and who they were. And around the fourth one in, I looked it up, and it was from where she was, from her name and from where she lived in El Barrio in East Harlem. She was Puerto Rican. And the letter said, the little letter said, she goes, Mark, you help everybody. And you know I have 4 children. Please don't forget to give me a small turkey for Thanksgiving. And I know you will, because you are the bread of the poor people. That was it. And I've been with it ever since. You know, it was just so amazing. And there are so many letters like that. We were mentioning Annette T. Rubenstein before, who wrote a wonderful, wonderful composite of excerpts of Vito Marcantonio, of his congressional work called I Vote My Conscience, Annette T. Rubenstein. And when she was coming back with her mother from a visit, a notice came across the radio that Vito Marcantonio had died and that he had been a communist. And her mother said he was never a communist. And the cab driver turned around and said, what if he was? You know, so Marcantonio has just led to so many, many different areas and you know, all kinds of remarkable figures, such as Leonard Covello, a great educator, cultural pluralist. And all untilled fields that nobody had bothered very much to look at. And I feel so privileged I was able to have this fortune, good fortune to do this. Well, what I decided not too long, I was coming back from a plane from San Francisco and I didn't have anything to read. And somehow I had some paper and I said, I'm going to write down whatever I haven't completed. Well, I got to 30 and I stopped. So that gave me a definite idea that I shouldn't start a 31st, project right away. And it dawned on me that what I've spent most of my time doing with writing essays, and the essays by their nature get published in obscure journals or they're part of proceedings for, for conferences and so on, and they're lost, they're gone. So I decided I would take what I thought were the 11 best of these essays and put them together in a book. And that's what I've been doing. And I've been working on that quite a while, and it's coming somewhere close to an end, I think. And the title I chose was The Unity of the People, Studies in Italian-American Radicalism. And Italian-American radicalism is an important subject because people assume that there was no significant radical movement among Italian-Americans, that they didn't contribute anything to the movement, all of which is untrue, simply absolutely untrue. And that's been my job, to sort of correct that misapprehension. And the unity of the people, that comes from the title of the Italian language communist paper, L'Unità del Popolo. I love that title, L'Unità del Popolo. And I did a study of L'Unità del Popolo. I learned Italian to do it. And it was absolutely earth-shaking, because there it was. I think there were only 2 copies in the United States of the whole newspaper, which was founded in 39 and was forced out of existence in 51. And there it was all there. And what was there? What was there was what you might expect to see in a communist paper, but a lot that wouldn't get into, say, the Daily Worker, for example. And really, the more I looked at these articles, what was clear, it was that it was a picture of a community. It was a picture of people making their life and finding a way to be a communist, an Italian. And I wrote an article about it. And so if I could start off talking a little bit about that article, L'Unità del Popolo. The original article was L'Unità del Popolo, the Voice of American Communism. And L'Unità del Popolo was started in 1939. And it was founded by a wonderful woman, Mary Testa, who I'd like to say something about, but also refugees from Europe. And they were Italians fleeing, Italian communists that were fleeing from Europe. And before Mary Testa became the editor of L'Unità del Popolo, that she was doing illegal work for the Communist Party. And what she was doing was that members would give over their passports and they would alter the passports. And she would sneak them into Europe to reconfigure the passports so that these refugees who were in absolute mortal danger, many of them had been veterans in the Spanish Civil War, and others had fled from Italy, to get them out before it was too late, and they knew what was coming. She did that work. She also brought money into France and into Spain to buy provisions and probably guns for the Civil War. A remarkable woman, very remarkable woman. I only had correspondence with her, but very impressed. She's the mother of Susie Roederloh, the girlfriend of Bobby Dylan. that was the inspiration of all of his political writings. He learned everything from her and her sister and her mother, you know. And but in 1939, you have this paper starting out, and it was a weekly. It was around 8 pages, and its circulation was in the range around 10,000. That increased during the war, and for special occasions, you know, like May Day, for example. And what was very striking about the newspaper is that I didn't expect, that the paper could manage and survive because of an associated mutual aid society, which was the Garibaldi American Federation Society. We'll just call them the Garibaldi Federation. And the Garibaldi Federation was the Italian segment of the International Workers' Order. And the International Workers' Order was a mutual aid society that offered very good insurance very cheaply. And they had 15 different nationalities that had part of the IWO. And one of them was the Italian one. And in each case, those nationality groups were really the financial basis for the newspapers. There were 400,000 copies of foreign language publication that came from the Communist Party. 400,000. At its height, which was 1947, the IWO had 187,000 members in 2,500 lodges. The Communist Party was much larger than we've assumed it to be, and I was interested, like other people today, to see, well, what did they do? What were they doing? They weren't atom bomb spies, I mean, whatever else. They weren't saboteurs. So what in God's name were they doing? And one thing they were doing is just putting together a community that wasn't like every other community. And they did it with, and when you see this in L'Unità del Popolo, it's this incredibly close relationship between itself and the Garibaldi Society, that it was an incredibly symbiotic relationship. The Garibaldi group, they supplied readership. There were 15,000 members of that, and they provided readership, but also funding. And the newspaper provided an education. And both had, you know, outcomes past that particular relationship, but that was the key to really understand what's going on. And what, if I could say, there was so much that might be obvious about this, but a couple of points that just were very striking as I started to read the paper is that there was no mention of the Catholic Church. None. No mention at all. So it's like, maybe never say bad about anything, you know, that if you can't say something good, you know. And during the Popular Front, there was very serious efforts to try to get some cooperation from the Catholic Church. And there were examples where that actually occurred. But that broke down. But there was, it wasn't mentioned. The Catholic Church wasn't mentioned. Well, then what else wasn't mentioned? What wasn't mentioned was the mafia. And that's, I thought, very interesting. There was nothing castigating or critical ever about the mafia. And again, practically nothing ever said. There was a very well written by one of the, and researched by one of the refugees from Italy, intellectuals who came to New York during the war. And he wrote a wonderful scholarly, article on the mafia, its derivation coming out of a kind of decayed feudalism, and there is no functioning state, whatever else. Wonderful essay, but there was nothing in the paper about it. And I think it really got to me about what occurred in the Italian community, but I think in the communist world itself, is they left people's cultures alone. They didn't try to Americanize or, I don't know, or Bolshevize, whatever. They were leaving people alone with their own culture, with what was familiar, and hopefully with local leadership. What Gramsci would call organic intellectuals, people that were born there and lived there and could be of service. That would be the way you could reach the most people as quickly as possible. It's a very, very short periods of time that we're talking about here. And of course, there was no better example of that than Vito Marcantonio, just none. I mean, in 2002, he was born on 112th Street, and when he died, he lived on 116th Street. He had never moved more than 4 blocks in his entire life. And he was an international figure and the spokesman for the left in Congress, and was nationally known. How do we know he was nationally known? Because when Helena Hagen Douglas ran for Senate against Nixon, partly why she was defeated was because Nixon and his bunch printed a pink sheet. And the pink sheet was lists of examples where Helena Hagen Douglas had voted the same as Marcantonio. And every time that Hagen Douglas spoke, or there was meetings or whatever, they passed out the pink sheet. 2 million of them were distributed in California. She was defeated. So, but this would have been meaningless unless somebody knew who Vito Marcantonio was. Why would that have any, So he was really a nationally known figure and national spokesperson for the left, while living in the old neighborhood, where, by the way, he knew the mafia. They were his friends, they were his neighbors, and they had a different attitude about that than the outside world. But what L'Unità Popolo certainly had a lot of was Marcantonio. I'm telling you, if he sneezed more than once, they reported it. I mean, they followed him around. I mean, if there wasn't anything that he did or could have done, he was on the board. He was the president of the board of L'Unità Popolo, and they were devoted to him, and they placed their hopes on him that they could have a voice for Italy. By the way, wonderful work that Marcantonio did for Italy, but for the Italian communities, but for the immigrants, for workers, for African-American people. And they really revered him. It went beyond revered. When he died, that was going to be pretty much the end. When I was doing the research, it's like a microfiche, and I was looking how you had to turn, this is like really ancient history. You had to turn something, and then the different photographic images would come up. And in the public library, the sun came right at that. I couldn't see anything. I don't know how I ever did this. So in any case, like you had to hold something up to prevent. Anyway, there was no further, what would you call, no further photographs of L'Unità Popolo. But that was in 1950. I said, but and it was like maybe in April or something. I said, but they would not have, whatever was happening, they couldn't possibly have shut down the paper before the elections. They wouldn't possibly do that. So I was being guided by somebody, and my hand went up, went into the machine, and there were the rest of them. So, but I think what L'Unità Popolo did so much is to, first of all, simply report on what the Garibaldi Association was doing. the lectures, the events, the picnics, all methods of providing a social world. We're so lacking that on the left that once existed, you know, where people, you can't make your life without that. What do you do on a Tuesday night? What do you do on a weekend? Well, they knew what to do. And it was congruent with their beliefs, with their lifestyle, and and making their politics happen. And so it did that a lot. What's striking too is the differences between L'Unità del Popolo and the Daily Worker. That, for example, when during the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, LaGuardia was opposed to that. And the Daily Worker really went after him. Well, L'Unità del Popolo, they forgot all about it, you know. So there were these differences which were adjusted to reach out to their constituency. I think what's interesting too is that the paper was in the Italian language, and the Garibaldi Society did its work in Italian. And I think something that's been terrifically overlooked is that the communist movement was culturally pluralist. It had no interest in Americanization and made enormous efforts to help maintain the languages and cultures of cultural minority people. It's something for us to think about. That's really something we're saying. Why are we going about erasing people's cultures? How is a loss a gain ever? You know, why is that good? How does that help the movement? How does that help people? And so I think that was very striking. That it's very integral. It's very integral. Another set, very, very, very rich set of articles in L'Unità del Popolo was for the American Labor Party. And the American Labor Party, on average, garnered 15% of the vote in New York City. And that could go up to 21%. It could go less, but the average was 15%. And it was heavily, the one area where they had the majority was in the Puerto Rican neighborhoods. It's very interesting. They had an absolute plurality. But there were any number of places in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, and elsewhere where they were the second party in New York City. And they were the reason why they made possible for the first African-American city councilman, the first African-American congressman, that was Powell, for the first Puerto Rican elected official, for many Italians that were terrifically underrepresented, for them to get elected, and for women. And while doing that, it put forward a wonderful program which focused tremendously on the struggle for racial equality and against the prejudice against the foreign-born. They made enormous effort around that. And that was organized in part around an organization called the Protection for the Foreign-Born, the Association for the Protection of the Foreign-Born, National Association for Protection of the Foreign-Born. And that became a kind of organizing center for that. And there was and Italians really needed that. There was a remarkable amount of prejudice against Italians in that period. It's very hard to imagine that today, but it was very real. And I recall that. I was raised Catholic, and my mother didn't say this, but her sister had cause to say it any number of times that the Italians were not Catholics. That's like saying Obama isn't African American. I mean, it was so insulting, so denying, and so coming from such a a place of superiority. And the Italians were treated that way. They didn't go to the Catholic schools. They went to the public schools. It was very, very different, a very different culture. And they were denied an employment. There was no one tending to their needs. The Catholic Church did wonders for the Irish, absolute wonders, but they completely ignored and rejected the Italian Americans. The great machines, political machines, which I grew up with, I was very conscious of, that they were always controlled by the Irish, and again, they were very, very uninterested in the Italians. So Marcantonio was a way to combat that by saying there has to be, by appending to all the bills that he favored or was the sponsor of, that there would be, the money couldn't be appropriated unless there was no discrimination based on race, religion, and national origin. And that was no tail on the kite. That was a very, very serious and important thing. So there's so much more to say, but there's something very kind of sweet about L'Unità Popolo. Most of the people that were reading that were immigrants. They may not have known English well. And there it was. Well, what are they doing for them? They're giving them movie reviews. Why The Dictator, Charlie Chaplin's movie, is a very good movie, and you should go there, bring your family. And why is Gone with the Wind the worst movie that's ever been made in history? And it went on in that way. It also could, particularly during the war, it was able to mobilize people. And it mobilized people, particularly during the race riots, and especially in Detroit, where the full efforts of every sort, and it was also true for the Garibaldi Association, was to find ways to mobilize the Italian community to, in some way, slow down or prevent or intervene wherever they could to save Black people from being lynched. And there's beautiful articles, and it's so heartrending. Well, what's bad about L'Unità Popolo? What bad did it do? There's none of it. It found places where people could go for picnics, and it educated people. It pled their needs and sponsored things. Well, what was wrong with it is that it was affiliated with the Communist Party. So what do you have to do in that case? What has to be done? It has to be destroyed, and it was destroyed. Not only was that destroyed, but one after another of the foreign language newspapers. At one point, 15 editors of Communist Party sponsored foreign language papers, 15 of them had been indicted. Some for deportation. The great fear was deportation, because you left your family behind, who you would never see again. That would be it. There were 8,500 people in America under order of deportation until the 60s. I know some of those people. Can you imagine living with that? And but in the law, it says that the host country has to be willing to receive the deportee. And most of the foreign-born communists came from Eastern Europe, so they were pretty safe. But that wasn't true for Greece, for Italy, for Finland, for Canada, and on, Britain, and so on. And the editor of L'Unità Popolo was deported. His American-born wife and his 2 American-born children came with him. That was not always what occurred. And in looking at the deportees, it's ghastly. It is so ghastly. It is so lurid. It is so unbelievable. There's a case with a guy 80 years old. He wouldn't give information about his son. So they deported him. He's 80 years old. He left behind something like 23 grandchildren, 15 great-grandchildren who he would never see again. That's not unusual. The list of those cases is very, very long. So the newspaper was driven out of existence. And with that, well, then what happened to the Garibaldi Federation? Well, what happened to the Garibaldi Federation was that, as being an affiliate of the International Workers' Order, is that the government declared it was not a mutual aid society. It was a political society and therefore could not give insurance. And so what they did is they took all the insurance money, $65 million worth of insurance that workers had put their money in quarter by quarter, dollar by dollar. They forced the sale of all property and all assets of the IWO and drove it out of existence. Membership of it, by the way, was evidence that was used for deporting people. This is a good reason to look at the history of L'Unità Popolo. And there's been almost no one that's done histories of the other newspapers, communist newspapers. There was somebody who did a nice job for the Croatian newspaper. The Croatians had a daily newspaper. No one really has done that. So there's plenty of work for people out there to do, and I hope people pick up that work. The part of what's a great part of the story of how big this movement is was Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was born in Hoboken. I was born in Hoboken. My mother was born in Hoboken. So I feel very close to Frank Sinatra. And he came from the poorest area of Hoboken. Hoboken is such an interesting small city. And it's the mile square city. But the poorest area of Hoboken was the southwest corner. And that was the Little Italy. The Little Italies were always built, without exception, where they inherited a community, generally Irish or German. They inherited a community, and with very antiquated housing, particularly plumbing and so on and so forth, and in the least favorable locations. No parks, no amenities, no schools, no hospitals. And those are the Little Italies everywhere. And that's where Italians lived. They lived in Little Italies. They were probably the most segregated group of people in the United States, including African Americans up to some point. The Little Italies, the homogeneity of them is just astounding. I've done quite a bit of research on that. And I have a nice essay about that in my upcoming book. And it was just a kind of Galapagos of little communities that, that were interconnected, but also different. I watched a very good documentary about Frank Sinatra, and I was so happy that they interviewed his wife, Nancy, and she talked about their courtship and how they got married and what happened. And she said, well, he was making some money, so we thought we should maybe move to Jersey City. That's the next town. She goes, I had only been there 6 times. I kind of grew up that way, but it depended what parish you were in, that kind of thing. And people didn't venture very far at all. So, but Sinatra said, Sinatra was the son of a working class family, Italian family, and his parents were immigrants. And what made things special, it's all about the mother. Forget the fathers. It's all about the mother. What does Freud says, who becomes important and famous? He goes, the favorite son of the mother. Now, in this case, there were no sons or daughters. So of course he was going to become important, but nobody knew how, well, he figured it out himself. But Dolly, her name was. I had an aunt Dolly. Dolly, and so Dolly. What was so important here, and this is very, very, very unusual. She was the ward organizer, the ward healer, as it used to be called, for the Italian community. And so of the Frank Hague machine. And there were, if there were 3 Italians that were part of that machine, that would have been a lot, but she was one of them. And she was like the godmother for endless numbers of families. Mark Antonio was godfather for hundreds of people. They did that. The godfather would be to make a connection with somebody that had some power. It's very interesting. They weren't fooling around here. It's about money and power. You know, with good looks is good, but that's not the point. And so with Dolly, she intervened for the whole community in the sense of being a translator of what? Of different dialects. Not a translator from Italian to English. It was from different Italian dialects. They didn't even know Italian. They didn't know Italian. The first generation of Italian immigrants didn't learn English. They learned Italian. Then they learned English. So and his mother believed in him, you know, and spoiled him. That can be useful. And he had wonderful success, you know, early on as a singer. He's the most important popular male popular singer in the history of American music. And he really elevated the popular music to another level. You know, he's great. He's absolutely great. He was also attracted to the left, and this has been overlooked, that very, very early on, he was attracted to the left. We don't know exactly how this happened, but Hoboken is directly across from Manhattan, like where Midtown Manhattan is. And so you could go on a ferry. There was 2 ferries, actually. And for a nickel or whatever, you'll be in Manhattan. And when Sinatra was beginning his career, he, of course, would go over to Tin Pan Alley, which is on the East 30s, and go places to perform or hang out or whatever. And by the by, he began to develop contacts and associations with communists. And he was involved with a series of communist-led groups very, very early on. And but the part, I think, that's rather than, you know, list them all and talk about what awards he got and so on, what is really special is that he went out and he confronted racism. He went where there was racial disturbances and riots and went there and used his celebrity to confront young people and to get them to retreat from their behaviors, their violent behaviors. He did that in Gary, Indiana, in a very, 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 very dangerous situation. And he also did that in Italian Harlem. But he also used his great gift, his great voice, to create propaganda for the left. And he used what he had. He was very generous. He was extraordinarily generous. And so it was about, you know, donating money and, but also being active, to being helpful, to try to advance the causes he believed in. And he did it within the community, the Communist Party, community. And, but what is most notable what kind of brings us all together is that Sinatra, with the involvement of people like Albert Maltz and Maripol, that what he did was help create a 10-minute documentary called The House I Live In. And in the documentary, you see that he's obviously performing, and now he's going out to have a cigarette. He smoked all the time. Everybody smoked. I miss that terribly. So so he's outside the theater in the back door, and he's smoking. And along come a group of kids, and there's first he sees a single kid, and then before him like a kind of a whole bunch of them. They're going to beat this kid up. So he intervenes, and he tells these kids, he goes, you know, when I was a kid, I was called a Dago and a Wop, and I think the kid was clearly Jewish, you know, and how we're fighting the fascists and we have to unite or they'll take over the country. And then he sang the wonderful, wonderful song, The House I Live In. The House I Live In, the music comes from Robeson, and he wrote many things, like the Ballad of George, the Ballad of Hill, and also the Ballad for Americans, and he was a very important composer, and the lyrics for The House I Live In came from his pseudonym was Al Lewis, but he was actually Maripol, and he wrote also the lyrics for Strange Fruit. And it was wonderfully done, and it was given a special Academy Award, and it was also given a Golden Globe Award. And well, what did he do with that? The money that he got, he gave to the California Labor School. It's very worthwhile having that, you know, and knowing that, and to see how someone who of celebrity can risk that and also produce works that are valuable, you know, valuable for the left. Well, do we have a Q&A coming up? What do you think? Would you like to hear more about Frank Sinatra? I can't hear.
Why don't we continue for 10 or 15 more minutes, and then we'll start the Q&A.
Sure. Well, with Frank Sinatra, I think what's very striking with Frank Sinatra, and I think this is very important, that he had this great celebrity. He was a poor kid, grew up in a tenement, and he said himself, he said, nobody will ever know how badly I wanted to go to college. And then he became famous, world famous. And as I've said, he used that very generously to advance very progressive causes and ideals. But things started to get hot. And it happened really around the Hollywood 10. When the Hollywood 10, who were screenwriters, when they were indicted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, they were brought before the committee. They refused to testify, whether or not they were communist or not communist, and the Hollywood 10. And Ring Lardner Jr., for example, and wonderful, wonderful artist. And Hollywood, which really was very left at that time, mobilized itself to oppose that. And Lauren Bacall, Bogart, there's so many wonderful, some of the best actors and actresses came to the fore and formed a big committee for the Bill of Rights, and Sinatra played a very big role in that organization. And he then went from those efforts. Judy Garland was involved. I mean, it's really, the list is tremendously long. And he went from that effort, which clearly failed. They all went to jail. And it's into going to an organization that was for a kind of umbrella group for professionals and people in the sciences and people in the professions and people in creative work. And that was formed, and he became very active with that, very, very, very active. And I think the idea was, with that particular organization, in part, was maybe preparing for something else. And because it did become one of the pillars for what became the Progressive Party. And in 1948, Truman was the candidate for the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party Dewey. And the vice president for Roosevelt's third term was Henry Wallace, erased from American history. He's one of the most important American historical figures you could find. He was a great figure. He was a scientist working with wheat, but also after being the vice president for Roosevelt, during the war, he was Secretary of Commerce. That had to do with the distribution of everything in the country to win the war. But what I think that he was from Iowa, that I think that what I would remember him most for is that he became the ideologue for the left New Deal. And he said when Henry Luce in Time magazine said that this is the century of America, the American century. Henry Wallace said, no, this is the century of the common man. And then he responded elsewhere and said that what the world needs is peace. And the way we'll get peace is if the Soviet Union becomes more liberal politically and that we become more equitable economically. And he was just a great, wonderful speaker. He was the editor of New Republic. I mean, tremendous resume of service and accomplishment. And the idea was for him to run under this Progressive Party, a new party that would oppose the Cold War and oppose McCarthy. And Sinatra was active in that, calling for that to happen, writing about it, and campaigning and so on. Well, things were starting to get very, very, very hot in America at that time. And a lot of it came from the Democrats. They were very afraid that Wallace would garner the margin for their success, that it would take away the 15% of the left liberals in the United States. So there was a tremendous attack on the left and the communists generally. And it was no accident. The timing was so obvious that the leadership of the Communist Party was indicted, I think, a month before the elections, that type of thing. But it started to affect Sinatra. And it started really with the columnists, like Lee Mortimer and Luella Parsons. What occurred really was that the FBI and other such agencies passed on the information from their the investigators found that would be in some way incriminating, and they would pass that information on because what could you use it for? You couldn't take it to a court. So they would pass that information on to one of the kangaroo courts in the Congress or to the columnists, Winchell. Well, they started to go after Sinatra, that he was a communist sympathizer, but also that he was a part of the mafia and somewhat a disreputable person because he got divorced and he ran off with Ava Gardner. And then I think what happened is, it's impossible to know exactly how, but Sinatra backed away. There was no talk, there was no statement, nothing. He backed away. I think in some ways it's, someone said to explain everything is to excuse everything. But I think there are explanations. For a performer, unlike, for example, a screenwriter, for example, there was nothing you could do. If you were blacklisted as a performer, you were finished. By the way, the off-Broadway, that came from blacklisted performers. That's where it came from. That's where it was. But that's what you'd have to do, is you work off-Broadway, you know, or like with Robeson, to sing in his brother's church. I mean, you couldn't rent a hall, you couldn't put up advertising, and he backed away. He just couldn't get on the ferry and go back to Hoboken. There was always this myth, which might have been true, that he would sneak back to Hoboken and go to a bar and stay at the end of a bar. His father owned a bar later, and but that might or may not have been true. But I think he couldn't do it. But he never named names, and he remained remarkably progressive. I think this is one thing he did, was he gave significant amounts of money to the victims of the blacklist. And this has been Ring Lardner Jr. says this, Bessie Blair, you know, that was Gene Kelly's wife who was blacklisted, and that he was very, very generous in providing money for people that were out of work. And he also became very active in the anti-war movement, in the civil rights movement. And he did that pretty much straight through. It's kind of scattered because he got very angry at Kennedy and he became a Republican for a while, but he sort of came back, you know. And I don't know, I mean, I think what I get out of this for myself is a number of things, is that, but one thing is that in America, you know, there is some opportunities, you know, in some ways. Our social structure isn't as tight as it is in other places. And so people can kind of get through the interstices and something could happen that is not expected. So for him to go from where he was to becoming a world figure and an artistic and a development of art and that's lasting, is something to be proud of and something that's important. I love those songs. I love those songs, the early songs, the ones by, you know, Hammerstein and by, you know, the great early songs. And, and so what would we want to do with that? We wouldn't want to trash that. That would be ridiculous. And, but it also shows the cruelty in the system, that when it's determined in some way to destroy somebody, it uses multiple ways, through the government, through civic organizations, through newspapers. And that went to such lengths in his situation. He was denied security, a security, what would you call that? A security right to go to Korea to sing to the soldiers. They wouldn't give it to him. They held up his passport endlessly, and they carried out an investigation of him that's breathtaking, that was coast to coast, that was in city by city for 2 years. They endlessly interviewed and tried to find things. And in the meantime, he didn't have a passport. When he got a passport, it was limited to just how long he was going to work there, and he had to return. And that's scary stuff. You know, when you're hounded like that, where the government goes after everybody you know, what is the effect of that? The effect is that for many of those people, they pull back. They don't call and offer a job. They don't get invited for tea. They are like, they become isolated. They become isolated. And that's a major, major reason. And that person's energies have to go into defending themselves. So what they can do, the work they could do, the money they could earn, the friends they could have, the peace of mind they could have gets wrecked because the United States government opposed what he believed. I mean, what did he do wrong? He fought for, very bravely, for racial equality, for, you know, a wonderful agenda of help to working class people throughout this country. And so I think that part I always return to. But he was able, Lillian Hellman said, it all depended of how young you were when things happened. Because if you were young and you could go through that, you could pick up the pieces. But if you were old, you would be destroyed. Well, this happened when he was young, and he got through it, and picked up the pieces in a very, very big way. I'm very happy to do this work, and it's very, very good for me to go out and talk to people about this work, because it's pretty lonely, you know, just finding information and putting that on a page. So I want to thank you very, very much for inviting me. And who knows, maybe 18 years from now, you'll invite me again. That's thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. We certainly will. Let me announce now the start of the question and answer session here. And let me invite all of our attendees to use the Q&A now, or the chat if you're much more familiar with it, to enter your questions. Submit a question, and we'll we have a half hour here. We'll try to address your question. So let me invite the attendees to right now submit any questions that you might have for our speaker. And to start off the Q&A, we do have our first question from one of our attendees, Art. And the question is really a two-part question. Part one, was it not Earl Robinson
Yes.
who wrote The House That I Live In?
Yes.
And part two, Gerald, does your book deal with radical and progressive Italian-American workers who became leaders in the union movement, either earlier in the IWW period or in building the CIO? So two parts to that question. Go ahead.
Earl Robinson, I wrote the music, and he was using Alan Lewis. That was Maripol. He was using that name. Wrote the lyrics. I'm quite sure of that, but I've made a few mistakes in my life, believe me. Remember now, the book is 11 different essays, and I cover all those topics. I mean, this happens to be a topic for one of the 11, but it's not, encyclopedic. It's an essay. So there's some, like the one on Untitled Chapter, that you're building some point of view around and so on. Now, I think in a good essay, you try to contextualize that, bring in background, but if you can't bring in too much background, or you really have a failed book, and a failed essay. So I think, I cover all those topics. I cover the topics of the unions in any number of places. And certainly, by the way, in L'Unità del Popolo. I mean, they were trying to encourage Italian Americans to become active in their unions. And the communist-led unions cooperated with that. There was always Italian leadership in the communist-led unions, for example. And also in the Furriers Workers Union, for example, the newspaper, the union's newspaper, had a couple of the pages were in the Italian language, and that was done elsewhere. There's great sensitivity to language. Like the American Labor Party always distributed literature in Yiddish and Italian and Spanish, always, and sometimes in other languages such as German. But the great figure I mentioned before, Leonard Cavello, who's in the book too, that he pointed out that the use of the original language is not that the people you're reaching can't read English. It's really a statement of the value of the first culture. And they did that. And I think that's the type of thing that, you know, in the movement today, we could think about as to how to develop ties in the immigrant community, how to break out of this wonderful movement, but it's so limited in terms of age and so on, you know, into people that are older and people from other countries and so on. And there are great lessons to be learned here. But thanks for the question. But it's there. It really is.
Thank you for your answer. And Shannon, do you have the next question for our speaker?
Yep. So next question in the Q&A from Jeffrey is, can you briefly touch on other movements radical and progressive Italian Americans were involved in? And the second part, what factors contributed to their decline?
Sure. Oh, that's a good one. I think that what work has been done on the Italian American radicalism has been generally on anarchism. And I do some of that in the book. I would like to mention one example particularly, but I think it's a mistake. Anarchism died out. A lot of it was after Sacco and Vanzetti's execution. I mean, anarchism simply died out. The anarchists played an enormous role in the early great strikes. You know, the Patterson strike, and the Lawrence strike, and others. Mesabi Range strike. Tremendous work that they did, but I think by the nature of anarchism, they couldn't consolidate victories. They were always starting from scratch. I mean, that's unreasonable. There was nothing to build on, and it failed. Even with Sacco and Vanzetti, they 3 years into their being in prison, they hadn't published any kind of propaganda aside from Italian. It's unbelievable. I mean, there was a kind of, this I think comes from a kind of localism in anarchism, where it's affinity group. It's very satisfying emotionally, you know, it really is. I mean, it makes people, you feel like it's the family you never had, you know what I mean? And, but it can't coordinate. It can't get larger past a certain point. And the energy goes into prefiguring some utopian life. I mean, and the communists went right over that. They building unions, building the CIO. Look at the IWO. Communist Party at this point had no more than 100,000 members. And just think of those figures for the IWO, you know, 187,000 members, 250 lodges, the CIO was, you know, on and on and on, all kinds of culture. The American Labor Party. The American Labor Party had 300 headquarters in New York in 1948. It might have been a little earlier, 48. We're talking about, you know, like the real deal, you know, and people they worked in this. It was very interesting. With the IWO, they sold insurance. They were pioneers in term insurance, but that also gave possibilities for activists to become a kind of insurance agent, to sell insurance. They had some income and they could be full-time workers ad infinitum. Not that they're going out getting very enthusiastic and excited and then it all disappears. And then it starts up again. It all disappears. So there is tremendously good lessons about that. But I do talk about anarchism a lot. I have one article about, which I think is a good article, is it's about, very interesting, it's about the culture of anarchists. And I think it was kind of a very worthwhile thought about what we're, in terms of radicalism, is really radicals don't win very often. When we do, though, that's like the big deal. But, you know, but we really, it's not victories, so many victories. And there's risks all the time. There are risks of getting beaten up. There are risks of going to jail. There are risks of losing your job. There are risks of being hounded, all of which happened to me as a kid. As a frigging kid, that all happened to me. That's just for starters. You know, so why would somebody be involved in this? What is it that would, and I think that one is, I think the comradeship, which I think has largely died out, at least in the older generations. I hope the younger people do better in that. The great Annette Rubinstein said, she goes, relationships last longer when a couple is not gazing into each other's eyes, but who are looking in the same direction. And that's been my experience. Comradeship lasts longer than friendship, because friendship is based on emotions. And I wake up every morning either wanting to kill myself or kill somebody else, so I don't act on those emotions. But then that takes a lot of work, therapy, and all kinds of other things, yoga and everything else. But with, so I think that, I mean, those are really the two movements. But there was the Socialist Party really just faded away. It was very weak among Italians, extremely, extremely weak. There was some socialism among Italian cloak makers in the Amalgamated Union. A lot of the members of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union were Italian men, and there was socialism there. But what happened with the Socialist Party, they became pacifist with Norman Thomas, and the Nazis were getting stronger. The fascists were taking over the world, and they were pacifist. That was hopeless. It was absolutely hopeless. There were sectarians that Italians generally did not get involved in. And so what was left? I think what was left was destroyed. I think they won in a way. That's what I'm afraid of in my dotage, my very old age. I think they won. They destroyed everything. How do we rebuild, really? How can we really take some of this information and think about how we can put together things like unions and political parties, cultural societies, all kinds of literature, and also, relationships that last a lifetime, and that our work, our decisions about where we go and what we do, as much as we can, are congruous with the hope of building a better society.
Thanks very much for that reply. And a question from Stephen. Why did Frank Sinatra eventually turn to the Republican Party?
That's a good story, but I'm not so good at these stories, But what happened is that Sinatra, coming from his mother, I don't know if it's from his mother, but his mother was in the Democratic Party. In Hudson County, I never met a Republican. I mean, the only Republican I ever met was my Uncle Otto. He was a Mason. He's German American, my father's side. I mean, everybody was a Democrat. There must have been some Republican somewhere, but they wouldn't tell you, But Sinatra was very, very active, Frank, in the Democratic Party. And I remember that maybe the best thing he did was to campaign for Roosevelt in 1944. If Roosevelt had been defeated in 1944, oh my God, we wouldn't be probably having this now today, this talk. And so he was always allied with the Democratic Party and with the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. So he sang at conventions, he raised money, and so on and so forth. And then he became friendly with John Kennedy. And John Kennedy frequently came to Sinatra's home somewhere in California, and he even built something for him to stay, some office or something. And they were really great chums and socialized a lot together, I'm sure. And Robert Kennedy, who was on McCarthy's staff and who had spies going on with Martin Luther King, that Robert Kennedy, he convinced his brother that Sinatra's ties with the mob would be politically too dangerous, and so Kennedy cut ties with him and went over to the Republicans. He came back, but he went over.
Okay, Shannon, do you have the next question from Margaret?
Yep. So Margaret asks, did Frank Sinatra's music reflect his progressive politics?
What's that?
Did Frank Sinatra's music reflect his progressive politics?
That's a very, very good question. I love that question. Thank you, Margaret. I think that, again, it's a very, very good book. It's a little bit daunting. Michael Denning about the cultural front. Very smart. And what he points out, and this was true in my experience, that what the communist movement did was advance two kinds of culture, a folk culture and a high culture that was humanistic. A folk culture and a high culture. I got both of them because of my associations with the left. I don't know what people get from their associations with the left today. That's where I learned about opera, and I learned about the great composers of music and so on. Jerome Kern comes to mind, and theater. I did the reading on my own. I found Russian literature for my own, you know, and it's lasted a lifetime, you know. But you would get that from that movement. What was denied was commercial entertainment. That was taboo. But it wasn't just a vacuum that was formed. Within that space, what was encouraged was high culture. What Sinatra was doing with his early music falls under the category of high culture. It's really taking popular music into art songs. I think they're art songs. They're like bel canto, like Napoleonic, Napolitanic bel arte songs. And I think with the songs that, you know, Where or When, if you think of, an extraordinary song, you know, The Way You Look Tonight, a wonderful song. I mean, and there's so many that they really kind of, they're really philosophical and mysterious, and it's poetry. If you look at the lyrics, you would think that there were 3 pages of lyric and there are only like 35, 45 words. It's art. It's really art. And it's something that can help you with your life. It'll help you. It'll help you manage difficult situations and disappointments and loneliness and everything else. Yeah, I think that's how he did it. Yeah.
Thanks for that answer. And the next question is a 2-part question from Leona. What about the role of women? That's part 1. And what role did immigrants play in unions as writers, etc.? Probably meaning writers and artists.
Good. Well, I think that Sinatra was a pig when it came to women. He was awful. He was absolutely awful. And I think that he joins the whole barnyard of pigs from that period. He was awful. He was absolutely awful. He married his childhood sweetheart. He had children. And the life of Ava Gardner and of going to Europe, he couldn't resist it, and he went that way. And he never really formed a successful male-female relationship after. There's nothing admirable or reputable about it. But one good thing that I would say in his favor in that regard, and I think it had less to do with him and more with his wife, is that he reconnected with the family. A lot of divorced people do this. They don't find anybody else, so, well, let's have Thanksgiving dinner together, and that leads to, like, let's have a weekend together. And so he maintained very successfully his relationships with his children, which is very unusual. Really, only 25% of divorced men have any relationship that means anything with their children. And he did that then. That wasn't easy without a wife and so on. And he was successful at it. But his wife, Nancy, cooperated with that. I think the other question really shows how much has to be done. I mean, I really haven't done original research on unions. I mean, I know something about them, you know. My father was in the UAW. You know when things were good in my house? When my father had a union job. And so why? Because he had Blue Cross. And when he didn't have a union job, he didn't have Blue Cross, the family fell into debt. And so the amount of scarcity, including food scarcity, you never get over it, ever. That was really a question of whether there was a union or not. And my family, and certainly people I knew that had the same attitude, but pretty much everybody was in unions. My father had such bad luck. The factories would close, that kind of thing, But that he really went through such hard times, and as an effect, the family did as well, my two brothers and myself. But I've read the books that anybody could read. I think one of the characteristics of a communist union was that they had a cultural life, always. So there would be, if you look at the newspapers, there would be sketches, there would be artwork. You think about Ralph Fasanella comes to mind. And there would be authors that would be in some way promoted. Remember, they would all have educational directors. They had, they would introduce culture in what ways they could. Now, what authors came directly from that experience, I don't know. That would be very hard for me to, I think something might come to me, but I'd have to sort of stop and think, I'm sorry I can't be more helpful with that.
Okay, Shannon, a question from Scott, or two from Scott?
Yep. Okay, so the first question from Scott is, were immigrants from Italy who may have been organizers on the left from any particular region of Italy?
Yeah. That's a very, very good question. That the common knowledge is that the leftists were in the north and the anarchists were in the south. So, but and there were communists, there were anarchists throughout Italy. Italy was like ideal. It was like a country that Marx invented. I mean, the class structure and you could see feudalism before your eyes being turned into, capitalism. And it didn't take, and the way people lived so communally, they lived so communally. They wanted to live that way. They wanted to live together. And they didn't want privacy. It's very interesting. What was valued was sociability. All of this really is very helpful for the left, and that happened in Italy. We got to be a little bit careful because there's sort of a kind of a development of a hierarchy of value with everything, and to some extent it's true, but we don't want to get too into it. But like that, the real communists, the real was in, Piedmont, but in Basilicata, that was just peasants, rummaging, rooting out vegetables in the yard, So it's hard to say. But what we can say is that certainly in Italy, there was no scarcity of leaders. None. Look at the resistance movement. My goodness gracious. I mean, how could there be a scarcity of leaders? I read some of, what's his name? Palmiero, Togliatti. I read Togliatti fairly recently. They wanted me to write an introduction. I couldn't do it. But, it's amazing. It was his lectures in Moscow to the refugees and with what he felt that the communists had to do. It was so unbelievable. He said, you have to go into the unions. They were all fascistly led. You have to go into the unions and you have to talk openly. Wow. And ultimately they liberated the country and executed Mussolini and his wife. I mean, they won. And there could have been, under certain circumstances, other circumstances, a socialist country there. But it doesn't all translate into America. And I do think that I talk about this in my book. I think this might be, I'm quite sure this is original, I think. You got to watch out for that. You know, like I convinced my people that I had invented the BLT, you know, so, but I think what's odd is this, that you take Italy, which had the largest communist party, you know, before Mussolini in Europe, outside of, you know, Russia, of course. And then after the war, the Communist Party, the Communist Party and the Allied Party, the Socialist Party, and any socialist, they had almost 40% of the vote. They controlled every single major city and the whole center of the country. Wow. And then we look at the Italian American community here. There's nothing resembling that. Now, why is that? My guess is going back in the situation in Italy is that the progenitors for radical activity were the professionals. Now, professionals in a situation like Italy was in, you know, coming out of feudalism, it would be very often a notary, for example, a notary, a pharmacist, a dentist, could be a mortician, by the way. But they were literate. They were literate, they had professional organizations, they were anti-clerical, they were Masons, and they were the catalysts. They were the ones that went to the craftsmen, which was below them, and then the great peasant masses below that. Now, I think what happens is that with the immigrants coming to America, Italian immigrants coming to America, the professionals, I think, didn't leave. A lot of them, people left because the situation was miserable. If someone has, if someone comes to the United States, if it makes any sense at all for them, they have a better standard of living, but their social status declines tremendously. We forget that. But why then would someone, these professionals, why would they leave Italy to come to the America, where their social prestige, their status would be very low, and where they would be, as opposed to people honored, they would be people that would be seen as third rate at best. And then I think with the craftsmen, who were the next possible group to be radicalized, their occupations were a total mismatch to the industrial societies that they came from, that they came to. I mean, they left Italy, which was in many ways semi-feudal, particularly in the South, but there were all these craftsmen, you know, cobblers and, you know, carpenters and glazers, on and on and on, metal workers and leather workers and seamstresses and, you know, musicians. Then they come to America, and aside from barbers, being a barber, almost none of the other crafts really have work for them to do. So they they become proletarianized. The unions themselves were generally hostile to Italians. They were Irish controlled and very often Jewish controlled, which was not the worst. But it took quite a while for them to develop their own leadership. I think, again, in the communist movement, they were very, very careful to have what would you call it, a composite of the membership in the leadership, including first and foremost Black people. Black people were in the leadership. They weren't a second thought, and that happened from the very beginning. If they were going to form a union, there were Black people there to form the union, not that they come in later. That's impossible. It doesn't work. Everything's already been decided. Everything's already decided. So now you're bringing other people to do what? To carry things around, you know? I mean, so it was done very, very well. Don't know what else to say at the moment about that.
Thank you for that answer. In the final 9 minutes, we'll try to answer two more questions. The first question from Christina. about the relationship between the Irish and the Italians in the neighborhoods, church, and politics. Details that a little bit in Chicago. She's saying there's acrimony between the two groups until the Anglo-Protestants started courting the Italians to convert their religion and make them part of their voting bloc. That's when the Irish changed their minds about the value of the Italians, according to Christina, politically. Is that something you have seen within the progressive groups in certain areas or nationally?
Oh, I love that. I lived that, you know. In Hoboken, the Irish lived in the northwest corner. That was where good housing was. That was by the river. That was by the river, as opposed to the Italians that lived in the southwest. They were the Italians in the southwest were of Hoboken were in tenements, where there was which were frame houses with some kind of covering. Very often, the Irish lived in brick houses. They lived where there was plumbing inside the apartment. The Italians, the plumbing was generally outside the apartment. You know, your grandparents don't tell you everything, you know, believe me, you know, so, but that's the way it was. And the prejudice was extraordinary. But the United States does not have a Catholic Church. It does not exist. It never had existed. There's no such thing as a Catholic Church in the United States. What we've had is an Irish Catholic Church. The hierarchy until after World War II was, I think, 100% Irish. The nuns were 90% Irish. The priests were 90% Irish. And not only were they the staff, you know, the personnel, it was their philosophy and their interpretation of Catholicism. And that's generally called, oh God, I hope it comes to me. I hope it comes to me in a minute. It's a form of Calvinistic Catholicism, Jansenism. I have slow recall, I'm telling you, but it comes, eventually it comes. What you had in the United States, the American church, was Jansenism. And Jansenism was seen, by the way, interestingly, in Ireland as a schism. But what it came from was that when the British controlled Ireland, that they wouldn't allow seminaries for the Catholics, and the Catholics had to pay taxes to the Episcopal Church. So because there were no seminaries in Ireland, Catholic seminaries, the seminarians, the would-be seminarians, went to France. And in France, there were seminaries there that that got them ordained, and they were ordained as priests, and then they were snuck back into Ireland. But Jansenism is Calvinism. It's just Calvinism, pure and simple. I mean, it's so cold, it's so rule-bound, it's so punishing, it's so fear-inflicting that there's been anything else like that. I mean, at least 90% of people that are in terminable therapy, it's because of that. It's because of the Jansenistic Catholic ideology in the United States. That ideology and the practices of that are remarkably, extraordinarily different than from the Italian Catholics. They're really two different churches. I mean, they're just so different. One thing is that I think the Italians never took it that too seriously. Like the Irish really believe this stuff. I mean, they really do believe it, the whole thing. And that can get you into a lot of trouble. But I don't think the Italians really believed it. For them, it was it's very much like Jewish people, I think the Italians, is that it's cultural. It's a cultural expression. And you can't really see yourself without them, which is a problem. In other words, there's so much anti-clericalism among Italians. And the men did not go to church until they were older, because when men get older, the women get more and more power. You do know about this, I think, maybe some of it. And the women get, women get more and more power. The men get less and less power. And at some point they go, yes, dear, yes, dear, yes, dear. And so they're taken to church. This happened to my father. So they start going to church, and then after a while they imagine they believe it. But this is incredibly different. If you want to look at churches, if they're very large and very rectangular, and like they look like a fortress, that's an Irish church. Regardless of what it's being used for now, that was an Irish church, because the whole family went to church. In the Italian circumstances, women and children went to church. Men didn't go to church. So it's remarkably different. I think where you can really see the difference most sharply is in the festa, in the festivals, around which took place around the various patron saints. And in the festas, which every Italian church had, which was smaller, they always sponsored a festa. And here you have, and what is that? The great famous movie about the, oh Jesus, it's not coming to me. Sorry, but in the festas, what you have is the spiritual mixed in with the material in a way that's absolutely unbelievable. That you have, the Madonna, the patron saint being carried through what is a festival, where sausages are being fried, where there's gambling, where there's all kinds of conviviality. And that's inconceivable in an Irish Catholic setting, so you really have, and I think the Irish church specifically was really hostile to Italians. I went to a Catholic school. Remember, my mother was Irish Catholic. And in the 8th grade, there was, I liked everybody. I was friends with everybody. This is because I was gay, I guess. I had to be friends with everybody. But in any case, I liked very much Conti. What was her first name? Oh, God. Let's say Teresa Conti. I liked her. But somehow she got on the wrong side of the nuns, And so at one point, I know we had a class was going on, and the nun left, somebody opened the door, the nun left, and then Conti, Teresa, she left the room and was outside in the hall. She then came back, got her books and her coat, and left the room, never to be seen again. The problem, she was being expelled. Why? She put on very light makeup, and extremely light makeup. And so all of this ritual of rejection with religion on top of it, with, the cruelty of that is really just unforgettable. I'll never remember it. And I've never saw her again. I'm sorry about that. But she had nerve, and thank God her mother stuck up for her. You know what my mother would have done? She would have stuck up for the church. The values, this all has to do with values. The values in the Italian family were family. And the values in the Irish family was the church first, then the family, maybe. There might be some saints in between the church and, Now, what I think is also very interesting is that there was a huge popular religion that was happening everywhere, including, I think, less, but it was also in Irish among women, because it was entirely a male-dominated institution from beginning to end. So women formed their own religion, in a sense, religious practices, which had to do with venerating saints. It's very much like Santeria. This is Santeria. But the various saints had various powers. Saint Blaise for the throat, Saint Anthony if you lost something, every single imaginable thing for good, Oh, my mother loved St. Jude. There were two Judes. I don't know which one this was. St. Jude, and because he was a patron saint for hopeless cases. That was myself and my two brothers. But in any case, but they had these religious practices, and they would make little altars, or maybe not so little, and there would be a votive candle, and there would be statues, and in a way, you could leave. I'm trying to think, kind of offerings. You could leave offerings. This is Santeria, for God's sakes. But they controlled it. The priest didn't control it. They controlled it.
Thank you for that answer. We're running close to the end of time, so let me assure the audience, the attendees, that we did not get to 2 questions, but those questions will be answered in follow-up emails from our speaker. So you will receive an answer to your questions. So at this moment, let me ask the speaker if for any final thoughts before we wrap up.
I appreciate the emails. I've been feeling very sorry for myself. You know, I'm actually 80 years old. I know that's inconceivable, but that's actually true. And I keep looking at, I'm not getting enough emails, you know. Does anyone else have that problem? And I kind of, I keep looking like, I got to check, you know, before I go to bed, I check my, it used to be like what I did with cigarettes, you know. I have to have a cigarette. I have to think, where are the emails? Where are the emails? So anyway, I'd appreciate very, very much getting your emails, and I'll respond to them. Try, if you can, don't worry about this right now. No. Unconditional emails, yeah.
And any final thoughts from our co-host, Seth?
Jerry, it's just such a pleasure listening to you again. It's like, you know, it's like 18 years. It's just been days. I mean, it's just this nice segue, and it's so timely. I mean, I think you reinvigorate, hopefully, our youth, young people listening, anybody. I mean, just the spirit of Marcantonio, and like, it's time to dream, it's time to organize, and there is a future. We look to New York, you have AOC, we have people like Rashida Tlaib, there's wonderful people out there. It's time for optimism. And I have such great hope in this country, and hopefully November 3rd, we'll have a turnaround, and we'll hear from you again soon, Jerry. After your book, we can talk again. Jerry, when is it coming out?
Well,
when are you planning?
It will come out, but I haven't sent it around. I still have a few things to do, you know, but at some point, someone's going to have to rip that out of my hands, you know. Maybe my son will do that for me, you know. But Oh, I would like to say what is something about the Veto Marcantonio Forum. Did I mention that? I don't think so. We founded that in October of 2011, and of people that have been very touched by Marcantonio in their lives, and very concerned and interested to see that he be included in the history that he made, and not be, not accept his exiling, his being, you know, completely erased, almost completely erased from American history, when he was such a great maker of history. And we've met, I don't know, could be 60, 70 times. We're putting together our records now, and our last event before the pandemic until this, we had an event on Veto Marcantonio and Paul Robeson, martyrs of McCarthyism. And we got 60, 70 people, and that was a good for us. And but we've also had, you know, all kinds of events, you know, theater, movie series. We've had walking tours of East Harlem. I mean, and it's been good. It's been really, really good. If anyone wants to join us, we would love that, because we could use some help.
And so again, we would like to thank the Veto Marcantonio Forum for being our co-sponsor. And we'd like to again thank our speaker, Gerald Meyer, tonight for this fascinating presentation. And thanks to our wonderful audience for tuning in and for your many interesting questions tonight. So from the Elm City, New Haven, Connecticut, we say thank you for joining us. Good night and stay safe.
Thank you.